Yo ho ho, and welcome to Watch This. I'm CJ Johnson with your final episode before Christmas. I hope you are having a happy holiday period. Paul Byrnes is one of Australia's great film critics. He has run the Sydney Film Festival. He has been a critic for the Sydney Morning Herald for 25 years. He's been a journalist for 40 years. He now contributes to publications all across Fairfax Media, and he's got his own website at Or, which we'll mention a little later on in the program. But he joins me today to talk about two major intriguing films that are releasing, in Australia at least, over the holiday period and are already out in the United States. And then we're both going to talk about one of our favourite films of the year. Paul, thanks very much for coming on Watch This. And I won't wear my Christmas hat the entire time. It's a bit too frivolous for the serious subject matter of our first film, Pablo Larraín's Jackie. He's a Chilean director, but doing this most American of films. It essentially is about the hours between JFK being assassinated and his body going into the ground, all seen through the prism of his widow, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, played by Natalie Portman.
I believe that the characters we read about on the page end up being more real than the men who stand beside us.
There's a bookend either end of the film where she talks to a journalist at one end and a priest at the other, but in between you get the 7 days of bedlam and grief between the assassination and the interment at that famous cemetery outside Arlington outside Washington, including scenes about where she decides, takes it away from Rose Kennedy, that he will be buried at Brookline, which is in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
It's a very, very intense film. It's very convincing about her anger and about the idea that we had no idea really who Jackie was. Unless you really knew her personally and up close, you had no idea what she went through. And that kind of makes it an interesting exercise in imagination, because some of this stuff nobody knows, and so they've kind of had to invent it, but it's very convincing.
I agree. Intense is the right word. It's a staggeringly sad film because you are watching someone not only at the height of grief and also at the height of shock. She is a woman in grief and shock throughout the entire movie, but also dealing with pressures that no one else could possibly relate to. She's married to the most famous guy in the world. He's dead, and she's trying to arrange a funeral in spite of a White House full of men who see her as a grieving widow and a problem. They want her to be out of the way in a way. Yeah, she is a burden to them.
Yeah, she's in the way, especially of Jack Valenti. And if you know anything about Jack Valenti, he went to Hollywood after he worked for Johnson.
Yeah,
so he's a
familiar
name. I interviewed Natalie Portman in Toronto this year, and she talked about that grief and the process of trying to prepare for it. And I said, well, one of the things that I think is difficult is that you can't really research grief. You either know what it feels like or you don't. You know, it happens to you at some point in your life. And she said, yes, we all have, our own experiences of it, but nobody had an experience probably in history like Jackie did of that situation. Nobody had that happen in public before, and then everything that she did being scrutinised, and that sense that that we didn't really know what was going on in the White House in that week afterwards comes through very strongly in the film. I think it is a very sad film, but it's also extremely dramatic.
Oh gosh,
you're never for a moment bored by what's going on. It's got this intense kind of, and the closer you, and I've seen it twice now, the closer you watch that film, the more you're going to get out of it. There is so much woven into it and embedded deep in it. Pablo Larraín's I think he's a very thoughtful director. This is his first film outside Chile, but his star has been rising a lot in the last few years. He made 3 films, I think, about the history of Chile.
Well, I loved No.
No and Neruda,
Yeah.
and which I don't think has come out here yet. And there was one in between, and this is he had read the script, in fact, 5 years earlier when it was first kicking around. Darren Aronofsky sent it to him again and said, I think you might be good for this. And he said, well, why me? I'm a Chilean, And he said, well, I think you can bring something to it. I think he does bring something to it, and that, you could say, is that he's not an American. There's these films with, for instance, the priest at the end of the film, who's played by John Hurt. I don't think you would have got those scenes from a Protestant background, white American director.
Right.
You get them because Pablo Larraín is a Catholic from Chile, and that dialogue with God, because of course JFK, being a Catholic as well, I think that dialogue about that anger that she has towards God makes a really interesting kind of coda to the film. I don't think an American director probably would have done that. I know those scenes were rewritten by Larraín halfway through shooting, so it's specifically his input that happened.
You're right, the film has so much in it, and I look forward to seeing it again, and I rarely see films again these days because there's so many films to see. It's so rich about not only the history and all the details that go in there, and also the murky motivations of Jackie herself, because she is operating from grief and from shock and from all this pressure. Why she wants to do what she does, create the greatest state funeral since Lincoln, why she insists upon certain things becomes so fascinating, filtered through all of these complications, including the use of alcohol and pills as well. The isolation of her in a house, a White House full of people buzzing around, how she is so alone with really only her press secretary, played by Greta Gerwig, and Bobby Kennedy, played by Peter Sarsgaard, as allies, and even their power and spheres of influence is limited. But also about the attitude to women in the 60s. It's not only present by these men in the White House, by the Jack Valentis, by even the Lyndon Johnson, who's trying his best but is still kind of, being a man of the 60s. It's present in Billy Crudup's performance subtly as the reporter. He is trying to empathize, but he is still showing a chauvinistic attitude that was ingrained in that time towards this woman.
Billy Crudup plays this reporter who comes at the first scene of the film to the house in Hyannisport to interview her. Now that actually does have a precedent.
He was based on a life reporter.
There is there is actually there is a new book out by one. I think it's Schlesinger, who was a White House press secretary, I think, or speechwriter, who did an 8-hour interview with Jackie. Sometime after, not in the week following. There might have been another reporter. I don't know about the life reporter, but I know that they consulted this book. But one of the things of all the things that they talked about, she didn't talk about the assassination in that book. So what they're basing her reactions on, I don't quite know. I think there's a degree of imagination involved in that, even though that there is a huge amount of research in the background. And in the most interesting part of that relationship to me between her and the reporter is the way in which Jackie is trying to take control of history. And she shows a very nuanced viewpoint about what history is, and not just that it's written by the winners, but that she is going to write it as a loser, as far as she's concerned. There's a whole lot of dialogue between the two of them where she will say something extraordinary, and he will say, and of course you're not going to allow me to print that, are you? And she says, I never said it. That sort of thing's really interesting in terms of and you think, I wonder whether she was that savvy. I don't, honestly, I don't know whether you can regard this as history or whether you can regard it as kind of speculative history.
Yeah, well, it's got to be speculative to a degree, because you have dialogue scenes between her and Bobby Kennedy, for instance, that obviously have been created as as speculative
Yeah,
fiction, really.
where they're the only two in the room, or scenes with her as the only person in the room. So there is no basis for knowing about those things.
And yet it jam-packs in a lot of history, doesn't it, as well? A lot of famous moments, obviously, the swearing in on the plane and all of this stuff, and gives you emotional underpinnings to decisions as to why, for example, she still has blood on her face when Lyndon was sworn in, and they are saying in this film that that was a deliberate decision on her part.
I think that part of it is historically. I think she did say, "Let them see what they've done."
Yeah.
And so there are parts of it we know we can connect to the public record, and you know, it's not. I'm not the scholar on Kennedy to be able to do that, but probably the more intense and interesting parts of it are speculative about what it felt like to be in the midst of that thing. I think Pablo Larraín has kind of has done a very, very good job with the film. It's quite a risky take on it.
Yeah.
It's very unlike most biopics in the sense it's not really a biopic. It's a depiction of a moment of horror. And one of the things that I know he tried to do, he said it at the screening that I saw him at in Toronto, that he did not actually have an idea of how to shoot this script when he first started to read it. He thought, I don't know what I'm doing, how I'm going to do this, except that it needs to be close up.
Yep.
And he said all of the previous attempts to depict the assassination and the aftermath have been too far away, so he wanted to take it close up. And there are some extraordinary close-ups on her in this, and also some fairly gruesome close-ups on what, you know, that assassination looked like.
I mean, overall, I loved it. I can't wait to see it again. I think it's so compelling, so beautifully shot. Some people are commenting that they feel the music, which is very Baroque, is quite heavy-handed, but I thought it suited the tone very well.
I think it actually sets the whole tone. It is very, very upfront and you know, impossible to ignore.
Mika Levy.
Yeah, I don't know much about the composer, but
she did Under the Skin, which was an amazing score.
Yeah, well, I think it's from the beginning when there's rising and falling, really strong tones in it. You can't ignore it, and it's. So I think Lorraine's attitude to music is that it doesn't sit in the background, and that it isn't there simply to enhance your mood or the mood of the scene. It's there to take you into a different space, and this one certainly does that. It's a kind of an extra character in the whole thing.
Absolutely, really does set the tone. Jackie opens in Australia in late January. It's currently playing in the United States, and I assume is opening around Europe and the rest of the world. Obviously, Paul Byrnes and I both recommend that you watch this.
I've grown accustomed to a great divide between what people believe and what I know to be real.
And how would you like him remembered?
There should be more horses, more soldiers.
Why are you doing this, Mrs. Kennedy?
There's more crying, more cameras.
Where you scream to watch that, watch this. And I'll dive down through this hairy flesh and ever-running bloodstream.